Hi everyone. 잘 지냈어요? In today's video, we are diving into the Korean past tense. You will learn everything you need to make past tense sentences easily, with plenty of examples. By the end, you will feel confident using the Korean past tense on your own. By the way, to keep things simple, we will only use 어요 polite ending. So you can focus just on the grammar without worrying about other forms. Okay, let's learn how to make the past tense in Korean. It's actually pretty simple once you get the hang of it. First, start with the verb in its base form, the one that ends with 다. Then, just drop 다 to get the stem. For example, 알다 becomes 알, 먹다 becomes 먹, 시작하다 becomes 시작하. Next, look at the last vowel in the stem. If the last vowel is 아 or 오, we add 았어요. So, 알다 becomes 알았어요. If it's anything else, we add 었어요. So, 먹다 becomes 먹었어요. And for 하다 verbs, it's always 였어요. For example, 시작하다 becomes 시작하였어요. This then contracts to 시작했어요, but we will talk more about that in just a moment. That's it. Pretty straightforward, right? Now you can at least say what you did yesterday in Korean. But if you say, 저는 어제 세 단어를 배우었어요. It sounds a bit awkward to Korean ears. This is where the third rule comes in, contractions. When a verb stem ends in a vowel, as어요 or 었어요 merges with the stem itself. Here are the rules for how they contract. Hold on, don't give up yet. And don't worry about memorizing every single rule right now. We will go through them one by one with the sample words so you can understand the basic rules. Later, we will practice with the common verbs and the adjectives to help you get familiar with the changes. First, if the last vowel of the stem is 아, it means as어요. So with 가다, you get 가았어요. Then that contracts to 갔어요. Easy, right? Next, this one is really similar to the first example. When the last vowel of the stem is 오, as어요 just combines with it. So with 보다, you get 보았어요, which then shortens to 봤어요. When the last vowel of the stem is 어 and emits 었어요, it contracts to 었어요. For example, the past tense of 서다 becomes 섰어요 after contracting from 서었어요. If the stem ends with 우, it means 었어요. So with 나누다, you get 나누었어요. Then that contracts to 나누었어요. When the stem ends with 이, it combines with 었어요, which then contracts to 였어요. For example, 가지다 becomes 가지였어요, and then contracts to 가졌어요. This one is a little more complicated. When the last vowel is 으 and there is no 받침, it can go two ways. If the vowel before 으 is 아 or 오, you add as어요, and the 으 in the stem drops during contraction. For example, 아프다 has 아 before 으, so it takes as어요, and then contracts to 아팠어요. On the other hand, if the vowel before 으 is anything other than 아 or 오, you add 었어요. For example, 예쁘다 has 예 before 으, so it takes 없어요 and 예쁘 plus 없어요 contracts to 예뻤어요. When the last vowel of the stem is 여 and it meets 없어요, it contracts to 였어요. For example, the past tense of 펴다 becomes 폈어요 after contraction. If the stem ends with 에, it means 없어요. So with 보내다, you get 보내었어요. Then that contracts to 보냈어요. Okay, last one. Do you remember the third rule we talked about earlier? For 하다 verbs, you first add 였어요 to the stem 하. So 시작하다 becomes 시작하였어요. But we don't really say it like that in everyday Korean. It contracts to 했어요. So in the end, 시작하다 in the past tense is 시작했어요. Nothing beats practice when it comes to learning. The best way is to use these past tense patterns over and over. So let's practice with the most common Korean verbs and adjectives to help you get familiar with them.
받다, 받았어요. 열다, 열었어요. 말하다, 말했어요. 모으다, 모았어요. 기쁘다, 기뻤어요. 기대다, 기댔어요. 작다, 작았어요. 살다, 살았어요. 적다, 적었어요. 죽다, 죽었어요. 생각하다, 생각했어요. 사용하다, 사용했어요. 만나다, 만났어요. 태어나다, 태어났어요. 느끼다, 느꼈어요. 만들다, 만들었어요. 중요하다, 중요했어요. 그리다, 그렸어요. 자다, 잤어요. 오다, 왔어요. 앉다, 앉았어요. 일어나다, 일어났어요. 쓰다, 썼어요. 좋다, 좋았어요. 이해하다, 이해했어요. 마시다, 마셨어요. 잡다, 잡았어요. 슬프다, 슬펐어요. 사다, 샀어요. 기다리다, 기다렸어요.
I know. Everyone hates exceptions and the irregular changes. I do too. But in Korean, of course we have some. Let's go over some of the most common irregular past tense patterns. First, let's talk about digit irregular verbs in the past tense. Normally, if a verb stem ends in digit, that digit changes to real when you add a vowel. For example, 걷다, which means to walk, becomes 걸었어요 in the past tense. So instead of 걷었어요, you say 걸었어요. But not all verbs ending in digit do this. Some are irregular like 걷다, and some are regular like 받다. With 받다, digit stays the same, so the past tense is 받았어요, not 받았어요. Life is never easy. Here is another curveball. The verb 걷다 also has another meaning, to collect or roll up. In that meaning, it does not follow the irregular rule. It just states 걷었어요. See? I hate irregulars as much as you do. The second one is the beub irregular. When a word stem ends in beub, that beub usually changes to u before adding a vowel. u combines with 었어요. For example, 덥다 becomes 더웠어요. But with 돕다, which means to help, and 곱다, which means beautiful, the beub changes to o instead. So 돕다 becomes 도왔어요 in the past tense. And sorry, but there's one more thing about the beub irregular. Not every verb or adjective ending in beub changes this way. Some stay regular, like 잡다, which simply becomes 잡았어요. Next, let's look at the 시옷 irregular. When a word stem ends in 시옷, that 시옷 often drops when you add a vowel. In the past tense, this means the 시옷 disappears before adding as어요 or 었어요. For example, 짓다, which means to build, drops the 시옷 and it becomes 지었어요 in the past tense. And with 낫다, to recover, the 시옷 drops and it becomes 나았어요. Now, did you notice something? Words like 나았어요 and 지었어요 don't contract into 났어요 or 졌어요. With this irregular pattern, you keep the full form without contracting. Here's the tricky part again. Not all 시옷 verbs do this. Some are irregular, like 짓다 or 낫다, while others are regular, like 웃다 or 씻다. The regular ones keep the 시옷, so you just say 웃었어요 and 씻었어요. Next, let's talk about the hit irregular. This one's a bit dramatic, both the stem and the ending change. When a verb stem ends with a hit and it is followed by a vowel, hit disappears. In the past tense, when you add as어요 or 었어요, instead of combining normally, it turns into 에 or 예. When 빨갛다 changes to the past tense, hit drops and the 아 combined with the stem changes to 에. So it becomes 빨갰어요. You will mostly see this in color words like 하얗다 and 빨갛다. The verb 어떻다 also follows this pattern. Now, not every verb with a hit does this. For example, 좋다 and 많다 are regular. They keep their hit, so you just say 좋았어요 and 많았어요. No disappearing acts here. Finally, let's look at the 르 irregular. When a verb or adjective stem ends with 르, like 부르다 or 고르다, first you add 리을 to the syllable before 르. Then 르 changes to 라 or 러, depending on whether you are adding as어요 or 었어요. So for example, 부르다 becomes 불렀어요. Now, let's practice the irregular patterns with the following Korean verbs and the adjectives to help you get familiar with them.
듣다, 들었어요. 무섭다, 무서웠어요. 졌다, 저었어요. 하얗다, 하였어요. 빠르다, 빨랐어요. 묻다, 물었어요. 더럽다, 더러웠어요. 긋다, 그었어요. 노랗다, 노랬어요. 자르다, 잘랐어요. 씻다, 싫었어요. 귀엽다, 귀여웠어요. 붓다, 부었어요. 파랗다, 파랬어요. 고르다, 골랐어요. 깨닫다, 깨달았어요. 줍다, 주었어요. 있다, 이었어요. 그렇다, 그랬어요. 흐르다, 흘렀어요.
Feeling more confident with 과거형? Time to test yourself with these 20 questions. You ready? 화이팅!
먹다, 먹었어요. 살다, 살았어요. 사다, 샀어요. 오다, 왔어요. 주다, 줬어요. 느끼다, 느꼈어요. 나타내다, 나타냈어요. 생각하다, 생각했어요. 묻다, 물었어요. 춥다, 추웠어요. 모르다, 몰랐어요. 좋아하다, 좋아했어요. 높다, 높았어요. 생기다, 생겼어요. 끝나다, 끝났어요. 바꾸다, 바꿨어요. 자다, 잤어요. 설명하다, 설명했어요. 울다, 울었어요. 일하다, 일했어요.